Hello everybody, welcome to jurycentral.com online classes for law exams. So today I will be discussing with you the subjective questions of Jamia Millia Islamia entrance exam of the year 2016. So people, let me tell you, in this year there were a total number of only 8 questions and each were carrying only 5 marks. That means only 40 marks were given for subjective part and 60 marks were given for objective questions. I have already dealt with you the objective questions and I will share the link in the description box below and also in the I button of this video. So today we will be going to deal with you a total number of 4 questions. This is the part 1 of the video and the rest of the 4 questions we will be dealing with you tomorrow. So let us start. Question number 1. What do you understand by the expression procedure established by law as enshrined in the Constitution of India? So I have already dealt with you the pattern of the paper and also the how to solve this kind of questions. Like you shall always start with the introduction or meaning if any and would always end with the conclusion. So let us start with introduction and meaning first for this question. Article 21 reads as follows. Article 21. No protection of life and personal liberty. No person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to the procedure established by law. This has been given under Article 21 of the Constitution of India. The object of the fundamental right under Article 21 is to prevent encroachment upon personal liberty and deprivation of life except according to procedure established by law. It clearly means that this fundamentally right has been provided against state only. So this right is enforceable against the state only, not against any private individual. The state cannot be defined in a restricted sense. It includes government departments, legislature, administration, local authorities exercising authority, powers and so on and so forth. But it doesn't include non-statutory or private bodies having no statutory powers. For example, company, autonomous body and others. Like I have already told you, like this is not enforceable against a body which is not a state. Then therefore the fundamental right guaranteed under Article 21 relates only to the acts of state or acts under the authority of the state which are according to the procedure established by law. Then the main object of Article 21 is that before a person deprived of his life or personal liberty by the state, the procedure established by law must be followed. So the right which has been given under Article 21 can also be curtailed off only if the procedure established by law, that means the law has been enacted after giving importance to several other circumstances. Like right to life means the right to lead meaningful, complete and dignified life. It doesn't have restricted meaning. It is something more than surviving or animal existence. The meaning of the word life cannot be narrowed down and it will be available not only to every citizen by the country. Procedure established by law means the law enacted by the state. That means every validity of the law has been checked before curtailing the rights given under Article 21, and this is only procedure established by law. Then case law. The scope of Article 21 was a bit narrow till 50s as it was held by the apex court in A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras that the contents and subject matter of Article 21 and Article 19 clause 1 subclause D are not identical and they proceed on total principles. In this case, the word deprivation was construed in a narrow sense and it was held that the deprivation doesn't restrict upon the right to move freely which came under Article 19 clause 1 clause D. So in this case, actually a differentiation was made between Article 21 and Article 19. At that time, Gopalan's case was the leading case in respect of Article 21 along with some other articles of the Constitution. In this case, the Supreme Court actually took a narrow view of the rights given under Article 21. But post Gopalan case, the scenario in respect of scope of Article 21 has been expanded or modified gradually through different decisions of the apex court, and it was held that interference with the freedom of a person at home or restriction imposed on a person while in jail would require authority of law. So whatever the rights under Article 21 can also be curtailed off if it has the sanction behind it, it has the proper authority of law. Whether the reasonableness of a penal law can be examined with reference to Article 19 was point in issue after Gopalan's case. In the case of Maneka Gandhi versus Union of India, the court laid down that the procedure cannot be arbitrary, unfair or unreasonable one. So the procedure established by law, see in this a procedure cannot be arbitrary, unfair or unreasonable one, and then only the rights under Article 21 can be curtailed off. Article 21 imposed a restriction upon the state where it prescribed a procedure for depriving a person of his life or personal liberty. So we can say that the rights given under Article 21 is not an absolute right, but it can also be taken off or it can also be restricted if according to the procedure established by law, that means law made by the state. The view has been further relied upon in a case of Francis Coralie Mullin versus the Administrative Union Territory of Delhi and others as follows. Article 21 requires that no one shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except by procedure established by law, and this procedure must be reasonable, fair and just and not arbitrary, whimsical or fanciful. The law of preventive detention has therefore now to pass a test not only Article 22 but also of Article 21, and if the constitutional validity of any such law is challenged, the court would have to decide whether the procedure laid down by such law for depriving a person of his personal liberty is reasonable, fair and just. So these are the three principles we shall be having while restricting the right given under Article 21, that it should be reasonable, fair and just, and it also have to pass the test of the criteria or the provisions given under Article 22. In another case of Olga Tellis and others versus Bombay Municipal Corporation and others, it was further observed, just as a malefied act has no exercise in the eye of law, even so unreasonableness vitiates law and procedure alike. It is therefore essential that the procedure established by law for depriving a person of his fundamental right must conform to the norms of justice and fair play. So the same thing also held in the case of Olga Tellis and others versus Bombay Municipal Corporation and others. Then the expanded scope of Article 21 has been explained by the Supreme Court in the case of Unni Krishnan versus State of AP, and the Apex Court itself provided the list of some of the rights covered under Article 21 on the basis of earlier pronouncement, and some of them are listed below. So in this case a list has been provided about what are the rights that has been included under Article 21. These are right to go abroad, right to privacy, right against solitary confinement, right against handcuffing, the right against delayed execution, the right to shelter, the right against custodial death, the right against public hanging and doctor's assistance. While dealing with the provision of Article 21 in respect of personal liberty, Honorable Supreme Court put some restrictions in a case of Javed and others versus State of Haryana. So there is also an exception carved out in the case of Javed and others versus State of Haryana. It says the Apex Court laid a great importance on reasonableness and rationality of the provision, and it is pointed out that in the name of undue stress on fundamental right and individual liberty, the ideals of social and economic justice cannot be a given go by. So all the Apex Court has laid a great importance on reasonableness and rationality of the provision of Article 21, but also said that in the name of fundamental right, the ideals of the social and economic justice cannot be given a go by only by widening the scope of Article 21, but in certain circumstances the right can also be curtailed off. Then we come to the conclusion. Thus it is clear that the provision of Article 21 was construed narrowly at the initial stage, but the law in respect of life and personal liberty of a person was developed gradually, and a liberal interpretation was given to these words. New dimensions have been added to the scope of Article 21 from time to time. It imposed a limitation upon a procedure which prescribed for depriving a person of life and personal liberty by saying that the procedure which prescribed for depriving a person of life and personal liberty must be reasonable, fair, and such law should not be arbitrary and whimsical. So the criteria has been laid as to judge what is procedure established by law. So it must be reasonable, fair and just, and should not be arbitrary, whimsical and fanciful. So now we will be dealing with you question number 2. Do you think that the legal aid to the accused is an important tool to achieve the goal of fair trial? Discuss in the light of the relevant provisions of the CRPC and the Constitution of India. So let us start with an introduction. Right to free legal aid. The right to be defended by a legal practitioner flowing from Article 22 Clause 1 of the Constitution has further been fortified by the introduction of the directive principle of state policy embodied in Article 39A of the Constitution by the 42nd Amendment Act of 1976 and enactment of subsection 1 of Section 304 of the Code of Criminal Procedure. Legal assistance to a poor person facing trial whose life and personal liberty is in jeopardy is mandated not only by the Constitution and the Code of Criminal Procedure but also by international covenants on human rights and declaration. So the right to free legal aid has been provided under Article 22 Clause 1 as well as under Directive Principle of State Policy in Article 39A and also in CRPC under Section 304. And also in other international covenants like International Covenant on Human Rights, International Covenants and Human Rights Declaration. Then Article 14 Clause 3 Subclause D of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights entitles the person facing the criminal charge either to defend himself in person or through the assistance of a counsel of his choice, and if he doesn't have legal assistance to be informed of his right and provide him the legal assistance without payment in case he doesn't have sufficient means to pay for it. So the right to legal aid has also been provided under Article 14 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So every person therefore has a right to a fair trial by a competent court in the spirit of the right to life and personal liberty. The object and purpose of providing competent legal aid to undefended and unrepresented accused persons are to see that the accused gets a free and fair, just and reasonable trial of charge in a criminal case. So this is the idea behind providing free legal aid so that the accused gets a free and fair trial. Then in Maneka Gandhi versus Union of India, it has been held by a constitution bench of this court that the procedure for depriving a person of his life or liberty should be fair, reasonable and just. We are of the opinion that it is not fair or just that a criminal case should be decided against an accused in the absence of a counsel. So this view has been taken in this case. Then Section 304 of CRPC, it deals with legal aid to accused at state expense in certain cases. So where in a trial before the court of session the accused is not represented by a pleader and where it appears to the court that the accused has not sufficient means to engage a pleader, the court shall assign a pleader for his defense at the expense of the state. So under this provision, an accused is actually entitled for a free legal aid if he cannot afford a pleader for his own and the expenses should be borne by the state. And the rest of the other you can read by pausing the video. Then the Supreme Court in Sukdas versus State of Arunachal Pradesh has held that a conviction of the accused in a trial in which he has not provided legal aid would be set aside as being violative of Article 21 of the Constitution. So it is very mandatory that the accused shall be represented by a counsel. Even in the in a trial in which the accused is not represented by a counsel, then the entire trial can be set aside as being violative of Article 21. In Ramawat versus State of UP, the Allahabad High Court held the requirement of providing counsel to an accused at the state expense is not an empty formality which maybe not by merely appointing a counsel, whatever his caliber may be. When the law enjoins appointing a counsel to defend an accused, it means an effective counsel, a counsel in real sense who can safeguard the interest of the accused in best possible manner, which is permissible under law. So in this case, it has been held that the choice of the counsel shall not be a formality one, but a person of a good caliber shall be chosen to represent the accused in the court of trial. Then next case is Ramchandra Nivrutti Mulak versus the state of Maharashtra. This appeal was based on the fact that the appellant was not represented before the Sessions Court in his original trial under Section 302 of the Indian Penal Code. So in this case, the accused was not represented by a counsel or in a murder case, and then a lawyer had been appointed to represent the appellant but had made an application to withdraw from the case. Despite rejection of this application by the Sessions Judge, the lawyer failed to appear for the trial. The trial proceeded without the appellant being assisted by an advocate, or the court informing the appellant that he could avail of the services of a lawyer under the free legal aid scheme. As per the judgment dated so and so, the learned judges equated the above circumstances to instances where the accused has no representation. So in this case, the issue was if the lawyer appearing for the accused files application for withdrawal which is rejected by the court and the lawyer fails to turn up for trial, it's a duty cast on the trial court to ask the accused to make alternative arrangement for appearance by lawyer or appoint a lawyer for the accused under legal aid scheme. So in short, I'm telling you, so in this case, the accused was tried under section 302 in a sessions court, and where the sessions court appointed a legal aid counsel to represent him, but later on he gives his withdrawal, he gives his withdrawal letter, but the sessions court actually rejects it. So now the question comes, like suppose if the lawyer doesn't want to represent a case, then is the court bound to provide another legal aid lawyer to the accused? So in this judgment, it has been held that the conviction of an appellant not represented by a lawyer was clearly in violation of the fundamental rights of the appellant under Article 21 of the Constitution. The trial was accordingly held to be invalid and the conviction and sentence imposed against the appellant set aside. Once a lawyer applies to withdraw and chooses not to appear, there is burden cast on the courts to inform the accused either to engage another lawyer or to inform him that he is entitled to free legal aid if he so desires. So I hope you understood, like even if the lawyer withdraws from the case, it's a duty casted upon the court to appoint another legal aid counsel if he is not in a position to afford one. Then conclusion, section 304 of the CRPC 1973 enables the sessions court to assign the pleader for the defense of the accused at the expense of the state, provided he is unrepresented and the court is satisfied that he has no sufficient means to engage a pleader. The selection of such pleader, the facilities to be given to him by the court and his remuneration are to be governed by the rules that may be framed by the High Court in this regard with previous approval of the state government. So all such rules and facilities to be given to the accused under legal aid scheme has to be framed by the High Court along with the previous approval of the state government. This facility also extends to any class of criminal trials before other courts as indicated earlier to try criminal cases in the state as it applies in relation to trials before Court of Sessions. Then question number 3, bring out clearly the notion that dacoity is an aggregated form of theft. Well, this question is this question should be that robbery is the aggregated form of theft, but the question is dacoity is the aggregated form of theft, and you have been asked to explain the answer. So I have given you the answer, so let us see. But according to section, I would give you my points. Why do I think that robbery is an aggravated form of theft? Section 378 of the IPC defines theft as whoever intending to take dishonestly any movable property out of the possession of any person without that person's consent moves that property to such taking is said to commit theft. So section 378 of IPC defines theft, says dishonest moving of the property with dishonest intention, and the property shall be movable property. Then ingredients of theft, like I have already told you, dishonest intention, then the property must be movable and it must be taken of the possession of another person, then without the consent of the another person, and moving, and must be some moving of the property to accomplish its making. So this ingredients of theft has been laid down in the case of K. N. Mehra versus State of Rajasthan. Aggregated form of theft, now I am dealing with it. According to section 390 of IPC, there is theft in every robbery. In other words, robbery is an aggregated form of theft. Theft essentially means to take a movable property out of person's lawful possession without obtaining his consent. Robbery generally takes place when, while committing theft, the offender either attempts to actually cause or merely cause fear of instant death, hurt, wrongful restraint to any person. So in section 390 only it is given that there is theft in every robbery. In other words, robbery is an aggregated form of theft. So section 390 defines robbery as either theft or extortion. So this is the reason why I feel like the question shall be robbery is the aggravated form of theft because it is given under section 390, and robbery is committed when the other person is actually put in fear of instant death, hurt, wrongful restraint, or any likewise. And the case law is State of Maharashtra versus Joseph Mingle. So in this case, theft becomes robbery when the offender commits any of the above acts while committing theft. It can also happen when he completes a theft and moves the property away. Dacoity is the aggregated form of robbery. So it shall be dacoity is the aggregated form of robbery, not the robbery is the dacoity is the aggregated form of theft. So which in turn is an aggregated form of theft. Dacoity is said to take place when robbery is committed by 5 or more people and they all share common intention. Then we'll come to extortion. In literal terms, extortion refers to the illegal practice of obtaining anything by the means, usage of threat or force. Section 383 of IPC defines extortion as whoever intentionally puts any person in fear of any injury to one person or to any other and thereby dishonestly induces the person so put in fear to deliver to any person any property or valuable security or anything signed or sealed which may be converted into a valuable security commits extortion. Like for example, if A threatens to publish a defamatory statement concerning Z unless Z gives him money, A thus induces fear in Z to give him money, hence A has committed extortion. So I have already given that. So extortion is defined under section 383. So robbery is nothing but a theft or extortion. And then we will be dealing with dacoity. In the case of Ram Shankar Singh versus State of Uttar Pradesh, there were 6 accused in the case of dacoity and there was no other information available or no charge made that there were more than 6 persons involved. 3 out of 6 were acquitted due to lack of evidence. The court held that since there were only 3 members involved in a robbery, it cannot be hold them liable under section 395. So section 391 of IPC defines robbery and section 395 defines the punishment for robbery, and the main ingredient of dacoity should be 5 or more persons. But here in this case, there were 6 persons in which 4 were acquitted. Only 3 members were involved in a robbery and the others were acquitted. So these are reason why the court actually acquitted them under section 395 and they were made punishable under section 392 of IPC. Conjointly committing or attempting to commit. These are second important essential due to which the accused can prove themselves innocent. In the case of dacoity, there must be 5 or more persons, but all those must be conjointly participating. The meaning of the term conjointly is meant to be an association or a union. So another ingredient of dacoity is conjointly committing or attempting to commit. So the crime shall be committed in association or in a union. The case law is Ray Mupanna versus Ray Mupanna Aparna. Then robbery and dacoity. So I have mentioned here few important provisions about the robbery and dacoity. So let us read. Robbery, punishment for robbery, attempt to commit robbery, and punishment for belonging to gang of thieves. This has been given under section 390, 392, 393 and 401 respectively. Then aggregated forms of robbery I have already discussed with you, 392 and 394, which deals with voluntary causing hurt in committing robbery. 394 deals with it, and aggravated forms of robbery is given under section 392. Then dacoity has been given under section 391 and 395. Aggravated forms of dacoity we just now have seen, it is given under section 396. Offenses connected with dacoity. So preparation given under section 399, assembling section 402, belonging to a gang of dacoits section 400, and minimum sentence in certain cases of robbery and dacoity is given under section 397 and 398. So these are the provisions that you need to mention. Then aggregated form of robbery. So aggregated form of robbery is given under section 394. It deals with voluntary causing hurt in committing robbery. Robbery with an attempt to cause death or grievous hurt. So if death or grievous hurt has been caused while committing robbery, then it shall come under aggravated form of robbery under section 394. Aggravated forms of dacoity is given under section 396, which is dacoity with murder. So let us read the penal provisions for an aggregated form of dacoity in section 396, which punishes if a murder is committed while committing the offense of dacoity or in the course of committing dacoity. In this section, it is not required to prove that murder was committed by any one of the members or all the members involved in the dacoity. Further, there is no requirement to prove that there lies the common intention to commit murder while committing dacoity. So it is actually not necessary to show that there has been a common intention to commit the murder while committing the dacoity. The only requirement of this section is to prove that there was a murder committed while committing dacoity, thus will make all the members involved responsible dacoity as well as murder committed. This has been laid down in the case of Shyam Bihari versus State of UP. So only conjointly a commission in a union is only need to be shown, not the intention to commit the murder under section 396. Then stages of dacoity, what is punishable under IPC? So actually the dacoity is actually punishable under 4 stages from the preparation stage itself. So let us see. Assembly for committing dacoity has been given under section 402 of IPC. Preparation for committing dacoity has been given under section 399 of IPC. So there are the 2 stages that we have mentioned. Even planning is also comes under the stages of dacoity. Then jurisdiction of court. In case of robbery, the offence is cognizable, non-bailable, non-compoundable and triable by magistrate of the first class. So this is the difference between robbery and dacoity. Robbery is tried by the magistrate of the first class and dacoity is triable by the court of session. Then punishment. Whoever commits robbery shall be punished with rigorous imprisonment for a term which shall not be less than 3 years, nor more than 10 years, and also be liable to fine. Now the punishment prescribed is 3 to 10 years, but in dacoity the minimum punishment is shall be punished with imprisonment for life or with rigorous imprisonment for a term which may extend to 10 years. The maximum imprisonment given here is life imprisonment under dacoity. In the case of Ashfaq versus State, the Supreme Court ruled that weapon with which the offender is armed is a deadly weapon within the meaning of this section if it is within the vision of the victim and is capable of creating terror in the mind of victim. It is also sufficiently satisfied the word uses for the purpose of 397. Then offences connected with robbery and or dacoity. Section 397 deals with robbery or dacoity with attempt to cause death or grievous hurt, and 398 attempt to commit robbery or dacoity when armed with deadly weapon. So these are the offences connected with robbery as well as dacoity. Then position in highway. If robbery is committed on the highway, the imprisonment may be extended to 14 years. The fact that dacoity is committed on the highway doesn't change the position or punishment. So in both the cases the punishment is 14 years. Then we'll come to conclusion part. To conclude, we can say that the definition of robbery contemplates that an accused should from very beginning have the intention to deprive another person of the property, and to achieve that end either hurt is caused or a person is placed under wrongful restraint, or it must be actually found that victim was put in fear of instant death, hurt or wrongful confinement when the same offence is committed by 5 or more serious in nature. So in both the cases, in robbery as well as in dacoity, there must be a fear of the person putting in instant hurt, death or in wrongful restraint, and the same is also applicable in dacoity if it has been committed by 5 or more persons. Then 4th number question. For giving rise to a valid contract, there must be consensus ad idem among the contracting parties. Explain this statement and discuss the meaning of free consent. Also give reason for your answer to the following problem. A sells a horse to B knowing fully well that the horse is vicious. A doesn't disclose this to be the sale valid. So this example is actually both a fraud and misrepresentation. So we will see what is the answer for the same. Introduction will start with it. Section 10 of the Contract Act of the Act mentions about what agreements are contract. It states that all the agreements are contracts if they are made. We have already dealt this kind of question while we are dealing with the question paper set of 2017, where a similar kind of questions was asked. By a free consent of the parties, that is free will, who are competent to contract, then for a lawful consideration and for a lawful object are not expressly declared to be void. The section also mentioned that nothing which is contained shall affect any law which is in force in India and is not hereby expressly repealed, by which any contract is required to be made in writing or in the presence of witness, or any law relating to the registration of document. And now we will be dealing with the free consent. What do we mean by it? According to section 13 of the Act, two or more persons are said to consent to a common thing when they agree upon the same thing in the same sense. So free consent is nothing but consensus ad idem. It says a consent is said to be free and valid when it is not caused by there are 5 things. First is coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation and mistake. Then we will be dealing with the fraud. So fraud has been defined under section 17, and according to it, the law provides 5 acts which, when committed either by the party or with his assistance or by his agent with the intention to deceive the other person, amounts to fraud. So there must be an intention to deceive the other person, like a suggestion as to a fact which is false by a party who believes it to be true, like an active concealment of a fact by a party, a promise made without any intention of fulfilling it, any other act which can deceive, and any act or omission which the law specifically provides to be fraudulent. So the intention must be to deceive somebody else, and a suggestion to a fact which the person who is making the statement believes to be false. Mere silence about facts which can affect the willingness of a person to enter into a contract doesn't amount to fraud. This is very important. See, mere silence doesn't amount to fraud. But if there's a duty to speak upon the person who is keeping silent, then it becomes a fraud. Example of such cases is contract Uberima fights, also known as contracts of utmost good faith, where full disclosure is expected. So, Uberima fight is actually an exception to the exception to silence. In fraud, it is said that mere silence doesn't amount to fraud, but contract of Uberima fights makes an exception to it. The burden of proof in cases of fraud lies on the party who alleges it. The party has to prove the circumstances which can lead to the existence of fraud. Merely making a mention of fraud in the pleading is not enough. If the party whose consent has been obtained through fraud had the opportunity or means to discover the truth with ordinary diligence, then the contract will not be void. So suppose if the party already has an opportunity to discover the means of truth with ordinary diligence, then in those circumstances that person cannot take the defense of fraud. And in those cases, contract shall also not be considered as void. So let us see. A sells by auction to B a horse which A knows to be unsound. A says nothing to B about horses unsoundness. This is not a fraud. Now I am telling you why. Because fraud, this illustration is also related to misrepresentation. Misrepresentation under section 18 of the Indian Contract Act has an exhaustive definition and can be divided into 3 types. The first type is when a statement is made by a person about a fact which is not true, though he believes to be true. This is not the case in fraud, in which the person is making the statement which he believes to be false, but here the person is actually making a statement which he believes to be true, and the statement is actually not true. So he is actually under a dilemma. Second is a type when there is a breach of duty by a person who is making the false statement, and he gains some kind of advantage even though it wasn't his intention to deceive the other party. So second is a type when the person is responsible for a breach of duty by making any false statement and actually gains some advantage which he never intended to do so. And the third is the type where if one party acting innocently causes the other party to make any mistake with regards to the subject matter of the agreement. So in misrepresentation, there's an element of innocence. But this is not the case of fraud, because in fraud, the person who makes a false statement actually has the intention of defrauding the other person. As can be seen from above, the three types of misrepresentation have one very common thing in common: the intention of the party which misrepresents its innocent. It is not to deceive the other party into entering the contract. The intention of the party who makes the false statement is a difference between misrepresentation and fraud. I have already told you. Then section 19. Section 19 deals with violability of agreement without free consent. It actually creates an exception. There's an exception under section 19. This is if such consent was caused by misrepresentation or by silence fraudulent within the meaning of section 17, the contract nevertheless is not violable. If the party whose consent was so caused had the means of discovering the truth with ordinary diligence. So this is the reason why I am telling you fraud is actually connected with misrepresentation under section 19, which deals with violability of agreements without free consent. So although there was no free consent, but still the person has the opportunity, has the chance of discovering the truth, but he fails to do so. So in this case, the contract is not valid. And now we'll come to the conclusion part. It can be said in the light of the above said arguments that according to section 17, mere silence doesn't amount to fraud. And also at a time when if the party whose consent was so caused had the means of discovering the truth with ordinary diligence as per exception given under section 19, therefore the sale is valid because A is under no obligation to disclose the nature of the horse to be as a rule of caveat emptor being applicable. So here also a rule of caveat emptor is applicable, which means buyer beware. Although the horse was unsound and A was silent about the unsoundness of the horse, but still B has a means of discovering the truth of horse's unsoundness, but he fails to do so. And also in this case, a rule of caveat emptor is applicable, in which buyer needs to be aware before making any purchase. So this is a reason why the sale is valid. So with this question, we are concluding this session. The rest of the 4 questions I will be dealing with you tomorrow. So I will be making a video on that, and you will get the notification if you have subscribed to the channel. So people also do not forget to give a big thumbs up to this video, and you can also share your doubts, comments, anything in the comment section below. So with this note, I am signing off. Have a great day.